That night, Savannah Reed walked into her father's house and found men in black standing like steel walls. In the middle of the living room, her father trembled like a withered leaf. The man who had once lifted her onto his shoulders as a child, who had promised to protect her for life, now begging for mercy from a man whose name alone struck fear into the hearts of all Chicago. And before she could comprehend what was happening, the words she couldn't take back escaped her lips. Take me instead of him. If you want to know what happens next, like and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far this story has progressed. Now, let's begin. The ER had been bleeding people all night. Savannah moved through the trauma bay the way water moves through rock, not smoothly, not gently, but with the kind of pressure that finds every crack and pushes through. Her scrubs were already ruined at 11:30. A GSW to the abdomen, 19 years old, some kid from the south side who'd been standing on the wrong corner when a sedan slowed down. She'd had her hands inside his body cavity for 11 minutes before Dr. Okafor took over, and even then she hadn't stepped back the way the newer nurses did. That involuntary flinch, that need for distance. She'd stayed at the table and called out vitals and passed instruments and kept her voice flat because flat was the only voice that worked in rooms like this. She did not think about whether the kid made it. She already knew from the rhythm of the room, from the way Okafor's shoulders changed. She stripped her gloves in the hallway and pressed her back against the cold tile wall and breathed through her nose for exactly 4 seconds. That was all she allowed herself. 4 seconds. Then she was moving again. 2 cracked ribs from a domestic on Archer Avenue. 1 pediatric fever that turned out to be meningitis. That one she caught, and catching it meant something, meant a 5-year-old girl was going to see her next birthday. And a 43-year-old man who came in claiming chest pain and turned out to be faking it because he had nowhere else warm to sleep. She'd gotten him a blanket and a cup of bad hospital coffee and sent him to the social worker and felt nothing in particular about any of it. Feeling things was for after. After was when she sat in her car in the parking garage and ate whatever she'd packed that morning and stared at the concrete pillar in front of her and let everything that had happened unspool slowly, at a safe distance, like a film she was watching from the back of an empty theater. She clocked out at 2:12 in the morning. The drive to her father's house in Bridgeport took 20 minutes in the rain. She had the radio off. She always had the radio off on the drive home from a night shift. The silence was necessary, was almost medicinal. The only thing that separated the part of her that worked in the ER from the part of her that was still a person. She turned off Western Avenue onto her father's street and saw the SUVs immediately. 3 of them. Black. Parked in a way that was not accidental. They were angled, blocking the driveway, spread across the street with the casual authority of vehicles that don't worry about parking tickets. The engines were off, but she could see exhaust breath still curling up from the tailpipes into the freezing air. Recent. The men standing outside were not making any effort to look like they belonged there. They weren't that kind of men. They were the kind who didn't need to pretend. Savannah sat in her car at the end of the block for 9 seconds. She counted them. Then she pulled forward and parked and got out. The man nearest the front steps watched her walk up without moving. He was built like something architectural, broad through the shoulders, hands loose at his sides, wearing a coat that cost more than her monthly student loan payment. He looked at her the way a security camera looks at something. Not with judgment, not with threat, just with complete and total attention. "This is my father's house," she said. He stepped aside. The living room smelled like Walter's house always smelled. Old wood, the faint ghost of cigarette smoke from years before he'd quit. The particular mustiness of a man who lived alone and didn't open windows often enough. The lamp in the corner was on. The couch where she'd grown up watching Saturday cartoons was still there, the arm still worn through on the right side where Walter always rested his elbow. Walter was in the armchair. He looked like someone had removed something from him, something structural, and what remained was held up only by the chair itself. His hands were on his knees and they were shaking, and he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the man sitting across from him on the couch. The man on the couch was not what she expected. She didn't know exactly what she'd expected. She'd never been in the same room as Luca Moretti, had only seen his photograph once in a Tribune article that described him as a prominent real estate developer with alleged ties to organized crime. A phrase so carefully hedged, it told her nothing except that the people who wrote it were afraid of something. The photograph had been taken from a distance, grainy, not useful. The man in front of her now was not grainy. He was extremely, almost uncomfortably present. He was perhaps 38, 39, dark hair cut close, a jaw that looked like it had been broken at least once and healed imperfectly. He wore a charcoal suit and no tie, and he sat with the relaxed posture of someone who had never in his life needed to perform confidence, because confidence was simply his default state. His hands were still on his knee. He was not holding anything. He did not need to. He looked at her when she came in. Not the way the man outside had looked at her. This was different. This was assessment, like he was reading something written in very small print. "You must be the daughter," he said. His voice was quiet. That was the thing that reached her first, the quietness of it. Men who shouted were manageable. Men who had no reason to raise their voices were something else entirely. "Savannah," her father said. It came out cracked. "Go home, please. Just, Dad." She cut him off, not harshly, but with the same flat efficiency she used in the trauma bay when someone was about to say something counterproductive. She looked at Moretti. "What's happening?" "A business matter," Moretti said, "between your father and myself." "Tell me the number." Moretti looked at her for a moment, not with surprise. She got the impression very little surprised him, but with something that might have been a recalculation. He nodded once, almost to himself, and said, 2.3 million. The number landed in the room like something physical. Walter made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Savannah didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Moretti because looking at her father right now would break something open in her that she couldn't afford to have broken. "He doesn't have it," she said. "No," Moretti agreed. "He doesn't." "What's the timeline?" "The timeline," Moretti said, "ended approximately 2 hours ago." The room held. Outside, rain tapped against the windows in uneven rhythm. One of the men near the kitchen doorway shifted his weight. She heard it, the subtle creak of a floorboard. And that sound, more than anything else, told her what was going to happen if she didn't do something in the next few seconds. She knew debt. She'd grown up inside it. Walter Reed had spent his entire life chasing the version of himself that was going to make it, going to turn the corner, going to land the deal that fixed everything. And every time the corner turned out to lead to another corner, he'd borrowed more money from sources that did not have patience or sympathy built into their contracts. She'd been paying off her own nursing school loans for 6 years. She understood what it meant when a number was too big to argue with. "What do you want?" she said. "Savannah?" Walter started. "What do you want?" Moretti leaned back slightly. He studied her. She had the strange, dissociating sensation that she was being read the same way she read a patient, systematically, looking for the information that mattered. "The debt satisfied," he said. "That's all I want." "He can't satisfy it." "No." "Then take me instead." The silence that followed was different from the silence before it. Before, the room had been quiet with threat, with the held breath of men waiting for instruction. Now it was quiet with something she couldn't quite name, a kind of arrested stillness, like the moment after a cardiac monitor flatlines before anyone moves. Walter was out of the chair. "No, absolutely not, Savannah. Sit down. Dad, sit down. You don't understand what you're... Sit down." She said it once more, with the same voice she used when a patient was about to pull out their IV line. Walter sat. She looked at Moretti. "I have a job. I earn money. I can work toward the debt. I'm more useful to you than he is." Moretti had not moved during this exchange. He watched it the way someone watches weather, not uninvested, but from a position of sufficient distance that the outcome doesn't require his intervention. "You'd take his place," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'd take his place. You understand what that means." "Not entirely," she said, and she was proud of how steady that came out. "Tell me." Something shifted in his expression. It was brief, almost imperceptible, a small movement at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile, wasn't quite contempt, wasn't quite respect. Was maybe all three at once. He looked at Walter, then back at her. "Leave us," he said to the room. The men moved without a word, the one near the kitchen doorway, the one by the front hall, and she heard the front door open and close. They were alone. The three of them. Moretti reached inside his jacket and removed a folded document. He set it on the coffee table between them. He did not push it toward her. He simply placed it there, like he was introducing it rather than offering it. "Sit down," he said. She sat on the edge of the couch. The document lay there. She didn't touch it yet. "The proposal," Moretti said, "is this. 2 years. You become my wife. Legally, on paper, documented. You live in my home, you appear at my side when required. You conduct yourself in accordance with certain expectations which are detailed in that document. At the end of 2 years, the debt is erased entirely. Your father walks away with no obligation, no consequence, no contact from my organization or any affiliated party. This is the arrangement." She looked at the document. "And if I breach the contract, then the original terms apply. Your father, tonight. And during the 2 years, what are you expecting from me?" Moretti looked at her with an expression that was almost clinical. The document specifies separate living quarters, separate schedules, a public arrangement only. I need a specific social role filled. I don't need anything else from you. Why? That's not in the document. She picked it up. It was 12 pages long. She did not have time to read 12 pages. She scanned the sections she could parse quickly, the dates, the termination clauses, the financial specifics, and they matched what he'd said. The language was clean, precise, drafted by someone who did this professionally. She thought about that for a moment, that someone had drafted this professionally, that this was a thing that happened enough to require expertise. "I want to read the whole document," she said. "You have until morning." Walter made a sound. "Dad," she said. She looked at him for the first time since she'd entered the room. His face was... She'd seen Walter Reed in bad situations before. She'd seen him after her mother left, after the first business collapsed, after the second one. She'd never seen him look like this, like a man who understood that his failures had finally found their edge. "Go to bed. Savannah, I can't let you... You don't have anything to say about it." She kept her voice even. "Go to bed. Let me read." Walter stood. He crossed to her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she felt how badly they were shaking, and she did not let herself feel it, the way she did not let herself feel the weight of a 19-year-old dying on a table. She patted his hand once. He went. She looked at Moretti. He had not moved. He was watching her with an expression she could not fully categorize, which bothered her. She was good at reading people. It was a clinical skill, essential, and she was not used to faces that didn't resolve into something legible. "You can go," she said. "I'll read it." "I'll wait. It's a 12-page document. I'm aware of what it is." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked down at the document and began reading. He waited. The rain outside continued. The lamp in the corner cast its familiar yellowish light over her father's worn carpet. Somewhere in the house, she heard Walter's bedroom door close, that particular soft click of a man who had run out of options. She read through the residency requirements, the public appearance schedule, the financial provisions, the clause that specified she was to maintain her employment if she chose, the clause that specified separate bedrooms in explicit language, the clause that specified the arrangement was not to be disclosed to third parties, the clause that specified... She stopped on page 7. "This clause," she said. Moretti looked up. "It says I'm not to have contact with any individual who poses a security risk as determined by you." She kept her voice neutral. "That's broad." "It is. It means you can cut me off from anyone you decide is inconvenient." "The language is protective," he said, "not punitive. There are people who would use your connections to reach me. I have coworkers, friends. I'm aware. This clause would give you the authority to... I'm not interested in your coworkers," he said. His voice hadn't changed in register or temperature at all throughout the entire conversation, and that constancy was beginning to feel like its own kind of pressure. "The The clause exists for contingencies. It won't be invoked against reasonable social contact. I want that in writing. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket again and produced a pen. He held it out. Write the amendment yourself. She took the pen. She wrote in the margin of page 7 in the precise handwriting she used for patient charts. Clause 7.4 shall not apply to professional colleagues or personal friends of the second party. Absent documented security justification reviewed by independent counsel. She dated it and signed it. She held the pen toward him. He took it, read what she'd written, signed beneath her signature without comment. She turned back to the document and kept reading. By the time she reached page 12, the rain had lightened to a drizzle, and the clock on Walter's mantel read 3:45. Her eyes ached, her back ached, her whole body ached in the particular bone-deep way that came at the end of a long trauma shift, and she had not yet slept. And she was sitting in her father's living room negotiating a marriage contract with the man who ran Chicago's criminal infrastructure. She looked up. "I have one more question," she said. Moretti was still awake, still present, still watching her with that same quality of attention that had unsettled her from the beginning. He hadn't checked his phone. He hadn't moved from his position on the couch. She had the feeling he could do this indefinitely, wait, observe, calculate, and that for him this was simply patience, the ordinary patience of a man who understood that time was a tool like any other. "Ask it," he said. "Why me? You could have taken my father. You could have taken money from someone else, found another way to settle it, written it off. Why the arrangement? Why this?" He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of a man who doesn't know the answer, the quiet of a man deciding how much of the answer to give. "Because," he said, "you walked into a room full of my men, and the first thing you did was put yourself between them and someone weaker, and I needed to know what kind of person does that." She looked at him. "And now you know," she said. "And now I know," he said. She looked down at the document. She thought about Walter, asleep or lying awake in the room at the end of the hall. She thought about the 19-year-old from the South Side. She thought about the 5-year-old with meningitis who was going to see her birthday. She thought about the ways that a body under pressure either breaks or finds the path through, and how after years of practice she'd gotten very good at finding the path through, and how that skill was the only thing she had to offer right now. She signed the document. She set the pen down on the coffee table and sat back and met Luca Moretti's eyes across the space between them. "When does it start?" she said. "Tomorrow," he said. 8 a.m. Someone will come for your things." She nodded once. She stood. She crossed the room toward the hallway, toward her old bedroom where she'd slept on school breaks and during the worst months of her residency, and at the doorway she stopped. She didn't look back at him. "If you hurt him," she said, "while I'm honoring this contract, if anything happens to my father, the deal is void, and I walk out. And whatever you do after that, you do without me." The room was quiet. "Nothing will happen to him," Moretti said. "You have my word." She had no way to know what his word was worth, but she had 12 pages with both their signatures, and she had a lifetime of practice at trusting the only thing in front of her. And so she went to her old bedroom and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the wall and did not sleep. In the living room she heard Moretti stand, heard the front door open, heard it close. She was alone in her father's house, and by tomorrow night she would be living in the home of a man she did not know, under the terms of a contract that could not be broken, in a marriage that did not exist, in the middle of a world she had spent her entire life avoiding. And the only thing she knew for certain was that somewhere in that world, aimed at her or at Luca or at something she hadn't identified yet, something was already moving. She could feel it the way she felt a room go wrong before anyone said anything, the way she felt a patient begin to fail before the monitors showed it. Something was coming, and she had just signed herself directly into its path. The car that came for her at 8 was not what she expected. She'd expected something ostentatious, the kind of vehicle that announces power because the person inside it needs the announcement. What arrived was a black sedan, late model, no plates visible from the window, and the man who drove it wore a plain dark jacket and said nothing when she came out with her 2 bags, except to take the larger one from her without asking and put it in the trunk. His name, she would learn later, was Carver. He drove the way certain professionals drove, with total attention and zero performance, like the road was a problem to be solved rather than a stage to be occupied. She sat in the back and watched Chicago move past the windows. She had slept 3 hours. She had woken at 6 and made Walter coffee and sat across from him at the kitchen table, and they had not spoken about the night before, not directly, because there was nothing useful to say about it now. The document existed. The signatures were dry. Walter had looked at her over his mug with the expression of a man carrying something too heavy for his frame, and she had looked back at him with the expression she used in the ER when she needed someone to stay calm. And eventually, he had said quietly, "I'll fix this. I'll find a way." "Don't," she'd said. "Don't do anything. That's what fixes it. You do nothing." He'd nodded. He hadn't believed her. She knew him well enough to know that, and she knew herself well enough to know that she couldn't do anything about it from wherever she was going, and so she'd finished her coffee and picked up her bags and kissed him on the forehead and left. The house Carver drove her to was in Lincoln Park. Not the area people meant when they said Lincoln Park in that particular tone that meant money. This was money that didn't need the tone. A narrow 3-story brownstone set back from the street behind a low iron fence, mature trees in the front, no visible security except the camera above the door that she clocked immediately. Carver carried her bag to the entrance, and a woman met them there. Mid-50s, gray hair pulled back, expression of someone who had long since stopped registering surprise at anything. "Ms. Reed," the woman said. "I'm Elena. I manage the household. Mr. Moretti is in a meeting. I'll show you your rooms." Her rooms, plural. She followed Elena up a staircase to the second floor and through a door at the end of the hall into a space that was nothing like what she'd been braced for. She'd been braced for something that announced ownership, something that made the terms of her presence clear through decor. This was a bedroom and a sitting room and a bathroom, spare and clean, nothing personal in it yet, nothing that said anyone had lived here before. The window looked out over the back garden. The light was gray from the overcast sky, and it fell across the wood floors in a way that was almost gentle. "There's a separate entrance to the hall if you need it," Elena said. She pointed to a door Savannah hadn't noticed on the left wall. "Mr. Moretti's suite is on the 3rd floor. He won't come to this floor without prior arrangement." "Okay," Savannah said. "Meals are prepared at 7, noon, and 7. You can adjust. The gym is in the basement. You'll need a key fob for the parking. Carver will get you one." Elena paused. "Do you have questions?" Savannah set her bag down. "Not yet." Elena nodded and left. Savannah stood in the middle of the room for a moment. Then she went to the window and looked out at the garden below. A narrow rectangle of brick and dormant rose bushes, everything brown and compressed with winter. And she breathed in the particular silence of a house where she didn't know the sounds yet. Every house had sounds. Her father's house had the creak of the 3rd stair and the way the refrigerator hummed differently in cold weather. This house was giving her nothing yet. She was going to have to learn it. She unpacked. She did it methodically, the same way she set up a patient room. Everything in its logical place, function first, comfort irrelevant. She put her work clothes in the closet. She put her books on the shelf. She plugged in her phone and set it on the nightstand and noticed that she had 6 missed texts from colleagues about the schedule swap she'd requested, nothing from her father, and 1 message from a number she didn't recognize that said only, "2nd floor, 30 minutes. When you're ready." She texted back, "Ready now." She went downstairs. He was in a room off the main hall that was set up as an office. Bookshelves, a desk, 2 chairs facing each other near a window that looked onto the street. He was standing when she came in, jacket off, sleeves rolled, which was the first time she'd seen him look like anything other than composed, though composed was still clearly the baseline. There was a man leaving as she entered. She caught a glimpse, 40s, heavy-set, careful eyes, who glanced at her once with an expression she filed away without analyzing yet. "Savannah," Moretti said. "You can still call me Ms. Reed," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "The contract uses first names." The contract is the contract," she said. "That doesn't mean we have to." He studied her. Then, "Sit down." She sat. He sat across from her and put his hands flat on his knees and looked at her the same way he had the night before, that quality of reading something carefully. "There are things you need to understand about how this works," he said. "Not the contract, the practical reality of it. Tell me." My organization is aware of the arrangement. My core people know what it is, a contract, a legal structure, a business decision. They don't need to like it. They do need to respect the terms of it, which means your presence in my house at certain functions and in certain contexts carries the same social weight as a genuine partnership would. Meaning they have to treat me like your wife. Meaning they have to behave as though the relationship is real, whether they believe it is another matter. And if they don't, Moretti's jaw shifted slightly. Then I address it. She filed that too. The way he said address, not handle, not deal with, address, like it was correspondence. Who was that man? She said. The one who just left. A colleague. He looked at me like I was a problem he hadn't been told about. Moretti paused. His name is Damien Vescari. He's my underboss. He has concerns about the arrangement. What kind of concerns? The kind that are his to manage, Moretti said, and his tone didn't shift, but the sentence itself was a door closing. She heard it close. She noted that she wasn't going to get more on Vescari today and moved on. The hospital, she said. My schedule. I have a shift tomorrow night and 3 more this week. Carver will drive you. I don't need... He drives you, Moretti said. That's not negotiable. It's not surveillance. It's safety. You're visible now in a way you weren't before. She wanted to push back. She looked at his face and decided the calculation wasn't worth it today. There was a sequence to how these things worked. You picked the fights that mattered. You let the rest accumulate until they did. She'd learned that in the ER. You couldn't resist everything at once. Fine, she said, but I go in and out through the staff entrance. I don't want my coworkers speculating. Agreed. She nodded. She stood. Savannah. She stopped. The function on Thursday, he said. A dinner. 14 guests. It's important that it appears natural. She turned. What does natural look like in this context? Like you chose to be there, he said. Like you're not counting the minutes until you can leave. I'm a trauma nurse, she said. I spend 12 hours at a time in rooms where people are dying and I have to look like I'm in control. I think I can manage dinner. Something crossed his face again. That same brief, unresolved expression from the night before. There and gone. She went back upstairs. The dinner on Thursday was at a restaurant in the West Loop that had been closed to the public for the evening. She wore a dress she'd owned for 4 years that still fit correctly and put her hair up and sat beside Moretti at a long table of men in expensive suits and women who wore their composure like a second outfit. She watched everything. She spoke when spoken to and asked questions that showed she was paying attention and deflected the more pointed inquiries. How did you two meet? How long have you known each other? With the kind of answers that were technically true and gave away nothing. She ate. She drank 1 glass of wine. She put her hand on Moretti's arm twice when the conversation required it, and felt him go fractionally still both times, which she noted and did not comment on. Vescari was there. He sat 4 seats down and he watched her throughout dinner in the way that wasn't watching. Peripheral, consistent, the way a camera watches. He was charming to everyone around him. He laughed at the right moments. He touched his wife's hand and listened when other men spoke and filled the room with the low-grade warmth of a man who understood exactly how to be liked. She didn't trust him from the first moment. She'd spent years reading people in crisis, and there was a frequency that dangerous people operated on that she'd learned to feel before she could articulate it. Vescari operated on that frequency. Everything he did was a performance, was a calibrated output designed to produce a specific effect, and the gap between the performance and whatever was underneath it was significant. She could feel the gap. She couldn't yet see into it. On the drive home, she said to Moretti, without looking at him, Vescari. Moretti was looking out his window. What about him? He's performing. A pause. Most people perform in social settings. Not like that, she said. He's not performing for the room. He's performing at the room. There's a difference. Moretti didn't say anything for a moment. The city moved past the windows, wet and lit orange from the streetlights. I know what Damien is, he said finally. Do you? He's been with me for 11 years. That's not the same thing, she said. He looked at her then. She could feel it without turning her head. She kept her eyes on the street. "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." Neither of them said anything else. The threats began in the second week. The first one arrived at the hospital, not to her personally, not delivered by hand, but a message left at the ER nurses' station for the nurse who recently changed her address. She found out about it from a colleague who'd taken the call and hadn't understood what it meant, had written it down on a post-it with the cheerful thoughtlessness of someone delivering an ordinary message. Someone called for you, said to tell you some doors shouldn't open. She stood at the nurse's station and read the post-it and felt the specific cold that was different from fear. Not fear exactly, but the physiological awareness that the parameters of a situation had changed. She told Moretti that night. He listened. He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that had mass to it, and then he called someone. She heard the conversation from the hallway, low and clipped, and in a tone she hadn't heard from him before. The tone of a man giving instructions he expected to be followed exactly. And when he came back into the room, his face was controlled in a way that told her something underneath it was not. "You should have called me immediately," he said. "I just found out." "The moment you found out," she looked at him. "I'm telling you now." "Next time," he said. "The moment." She held his eyes. "You don't get to set the terms of when I communicate with you. That's not in the contract." His jaw tightened. "This isn't about the contract. Everything between us is about the contract." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression. Not anger, not quite. Something older than anger. Something that looked almost like a wall being reinforced. And then it settled back into the controlled surface. "There are people," he said, "who will try to reach me through you, now that you're visible. The message at the hospital is, it's a test. They're seeing if you're a pressure point." "Am I?" He didn't answer immediately. "That depends," he said, "on whether you act like one." She thought about that. Then she nodded once and went upstairs. The surveillance photo appeared on the third week. She found it slipped under her car door in the hospital parking lot. A photograph of her leaving the building, walking toward the car, taken from a distance with a long lens. On the back, handwritten, "She's lovely." Does he know what she costs? She sat in the car and held the photograph and breathed through her nose for 4 seconds. Then she drove home and put it on Moretti's desk without a word and watched him look at it. His face did not change. That was the thing. She was learning his face now, learning its topography, the subtle degrees of shift that meant something was happening underneath. And she could see something happening now, could see a muscle in his jaw doing something it didn't do when everything was ordinary. "Where?" he said. "My car. Hospital lot." He looked up from the photograph. "When?" "This afternoon. Between 2 and 6, I was inside." He held the photograph for another moment. Then he set it down very precisely on the center of the desk, the way someone sets something down when they're being deliberate about not crushing it. "You're being watched," he said, "which means my people failed. Or someone else's people are better." He looked at her. "I'm not trying to score points," she said. "I'm giving you the most accurate read of the information." He stood and walked to the window and looked out at the street. His back was to her. She watched the set of his shoulders, the tension across them, the way he was holding himself like something under compression. "The dinner last week," he said. "Who did you speak with specifically?" She went through it. Every conversation, every name, every moment. She had a good memory, clinical training, years of patient information held in active recall. And she recited it back cleanly. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Vescari sat near you. 4 seats down. Did he speak to you directly?" "Twice, standard social, nothing specific." He was quiet. "Luca." She used his name without deciding to, and heard herself do it, and didn't correct it. "What aren't you telling me?" He turned from the window. He looked at her with that expression she'd been cataloging and hadn't fully resolved, the one that lived below the controlled surface, that showed up in the specific angle of his eyes when something reached through the composure. "There are things happening in my organization," he said. "Things that predate you. Your presence has accelerated a A timeline I hadn't anticipated. What kind of things? Internal, he said. Old. Old enough that you should have seen them coming. His mouth moved, not quite a flinch. Yes. She looked at him. In the lamplight of the office, with the photograph still on the desk between them, he looked for the first time like something she recognized from the ER. Not a man in control of his situation, but a man holding it together through precision and will, the same way a body under physiological stress holds together until the moment it doesn't. She picked up the photograph. Keep it, she said. I assume you need it. She left the office and went upstairs and changed into her running clothes and went down to the basement gym and ran 4 miles on the treadmill at a pace that hurt, because pain was information, and right now information was the only thing she trusted. She was on the 3rd mile when she heard the basement door open. She didn't stop running. She heard footsteps on the stairs. Not Carver's, not Elena's, the wrong weight. And then she saw him at the edge of her vision, Luca, standing at the bottom of the stairs watching her run. She didn't stop. After a moment, he crossed to the weight bench and sat. He didn't speak. He watched her with his forearms on his knees in the posture of a man who is either very tired or very close to it. And she kept running, and they stayed like that for a long time in the sound of the treadmill and her breathing. She hit 4 miles and slowed the machine and stepped off and grabbed her towel. You could have said whatever you came to say upstairs, she said. I know, he said. She looked at him. Someone inside my organization, he said, is moving against me. I've known it for months, I don't know who, and now they know about you, which means they know what I... He stopped. He reset. Which means they have more information than I wanted them to have. What kind of moving against you? Financial, structural. They're building something, redirecting funds, creating leverage, using channels I can't see clearly enough to trace yet. It's been going on longer than I realized. Someone has been very careful. And you think the photograph is connected? I think everything is connected, he said. I just don't have the shape of it yet. She sat down on the end of the treadmill. She looked at him sitting there on the weight bench in his dress shirt and trousers in her basement gym at 9:45 at night, looking like a man who was carrying something he hadn't chosen to carry and was too stubborn to put down. When you do know the shape of it, she said, tell me. He looked up. I'm inside your house, she said. I'm at your dinners. I'm being photographed in hospital parking lots. Whatever is aimed at you is also aimed at me now. So when you know, you tell me. That's not negotiable. He held her eyes for a long moment. Yes, he said. She nodded. She stood and picked up her water bottle and crossed toward the stairs. She was on the 2nd step when his voice came from behind her. Savannah. She stopped. The night you walked in, he said, before you stepped in front of my men, were you afraid? She thought about it honestly. She turned halfway. Yes, she said, but fear is just information. It tells you the stakes. It doesn't tell you what to do. She went upstairs. She was in bed and almost asleep when her phone lit up. Not a call, a text from her father's number sent at 11:52 p.m. They came back tonight, different men. They said the debt isn't cleared. They said Luca doesn't know what he actually owes. Savannah. They had a document, an older document, with numbers I've never seen. I don't understand any of this, but they said if I contacted Luca directly, they would... The message cut off. She called Walter's number. It rang 8 times. No answer. She was already out of bed, already moving toward the door when her phone lit up again. Not her father, a number she didn't recognize, and when she answered it, there was no voice on the other end, only the sound of a room, the ambient noise of somewhere enclosed and quiet, and then a sound she knew because she'd spent years learning to identify sounds that didn't belong. The sound of someone breathing through pain. Dad, she said. The line went dead. She stood in the hallway in the dark with her phone in her hand and the cold floor under her bare feet and the silence of the house around her and everything she had been holding with such precision in the weeks since she'd signed that document, all the controlled distance, all the clinical management of what this was and wasn't, came apart at once, clean and sudden, like a suture line failing. She went to the stairs. She took them to the 3rd floor. She knocked on Luca's door, hard, and when it opened, she looked at his face in the low light of the hallway and said, with her voice completely flat and completely steady, in the way that meant the opposite of calm, "Someone took my father." Luca was already awake. That was the first thing she registered. He opened the door too fast, fully dressed, jacket on, which meant he hadn't been sleeping, which meant something had already reached him before she knocked. His eyes went to her face, and whatever he read there made his jaw set in a way she'd learned to recognize as the outermost edge of what passed for alarm in a man who'd engineered his entire nervous system against visible reaction. "Tell me," he said. She told him. The texts, the cut-off message, the phone call with nothing on the other end except breathing and pain. She kept it linear, kept it factual, the same way she reported a patient's deterioration. No editorializing, no affect, just the sequence of events in the order they'd occurred. She watched him process it in real time, watched the information move through him like a current finding its path. He stepped back from the door. "Come in." The third floor was nothing like she'd imagined. She hadn't imagined it specifically, had made a deliberate practice of not forming pictures of spaces she hadn't been invited into. But some part of her had assumed. She didn't know what she'd assumed. Something colder, more deliberate. What she walked into was a room with too many books and a desk buried under paper and a jacket thrown over the back of a chair with the casualness of a man who lived alone and had stopped performing for an empty room. The lamp on the desk was on. A coffee cup sat beside a stack of folders. He'd been working. He crossed to the desk and picked up his phone and made a call. He turned partly away from her when he did it, not entirely, and she heard him say, "Walter Reed, Bridgeport address. Now. Full sweep." A pause. "I don't care what time it is." He ended the call and made another immediately, this one shorter. A name, an address, a single instruction she couldn't fully hear. When he turned back to her, his face was doing the controlled thing, but his eyes were different. They were the eyes of a man moving through a problem at speed, pulling at threads, calculating variables she wasn't privy to. "Sit down," he said. "I don't want to sit down." "Then stand." He pulled out his desk chair and sat himself, which she understood was a deliberate choice. If she wasn't going to sit, he would, to keep the room from becoming something it didn't need to be yet. He opened the top folder on the desk and then closed it again. He put both hands flat on the surface. "The men who came to your father tonight, he said they had a document. An older document, with numbers he didn't recognize. Did he describe the document?" "He said he didn't understand it. He was cut off before—" She stopped. She pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth for exactly 2 seconds and then lowered it. He was in the middle of a sentence. Luca was quiet. His right hand moved, a small movement, 2 fingers pressing against the desk surface and releasing, pressing and releasing, the only visible evidence of something operating under pressure. "The debt," he said. "Your father's original debt to my organization. What did he tell you about it? How it started?" She looked at him. "What does that have to do with—" "Answer me, Savannah." The sharpness of it, not loud, not aggressive, but precise, the word landing like a scalpel rather than a fist, made her stop. She looked at his face. There was something in it now that hadn't been there before, something that looked almost like urgency stripped of its composure. "He said he borrowed against his company," she said. "Years ago, the second business, the logistics operation. He needed capital to keep it running, and he borrowed from people who could provide it without the documentation a bank would require. The interest compounded, the business failed, the debt stayed." "How long ago?" 7 years, maybe 8. "And he never showed you the original paperwork?" "No, I didn't ask to see it. I assumed—" She heard herself say the word and stopped. She'd assumed. She, who spent her professional life operating only on evidence directly in front of her, who had learned through years of near misses that assumptions were how patients died. She had assumed. "What are you telling me?" Luca stood. He crossed to the bookshelf on the far wall. Not books, she saw now, but binders, dozens of them, organized by year, and pulled one out. He brought it to the desk and opened it and turned it toward her, and she looked at what was inside. Financial records. She wasn't an accountant, wasn't trained to read the specific language of money moving through structured channels, but she'd been sitting beside this man for weeks and absorbing by proximity some understanding of how his world was documented, and she looked at the pages and understood enough. She understood the company name, Reed Logistics, her father's second venture, and she understood the dates, and she understood that the amounts on these pages were not the amounts Walter had described to her, not even close. "This is what the original transaction looked like," Luca said. He was standing beside her now, not crowding her, but close enough that she could hear the evenness he was imposing on his own breathing. Reed Logistics borrowed $400,000 against a 2-year repayment structure. Standard terms. Manageable, even with interest compounding. She looked at the number. 400,000. She looked at the date, 9 years ago. She looked at the repayment structure, which was exactly what Luca described. "The debt he owes me," Luca said, "was presented to me as $2.3 million. She looked up. "I didn't originate that number," he said. His voice was very flat now, very precise. "I received it as inherited documentation when the account transferred to my direct oversight 8 months ago. I reviewed the file. I had no reason to question the compounding history because the documentation was thorough, complete. It had been managed for years through a channel I trusted." She heard what he wasn't saying. She heard the shape of it before the word formed. "Vescari," she said. Luca didn't answer. He crossed back to the desk and picked up another folder and opened it, and she saw that this one was different. Not organized, not clean, but assembled with the controlled urgency of someone pulling things together quickly, pages with handwritten annotations, printed records with sections circled, photographs she couldn't make out from where she stood. "I've been building this for 4 months," he said. "Not fast enough." He fabricated the debt. He fabricated the debt. Luca set the folder down. "Your father's company became a vehicle. Vescari layered transactions through it over a period of years. Money moving in, money moving out, amounts adjusted, records altered. Your father likely had no idea what was being routed through his company's accounts. By the time the business failed, the paper trail had been constructed to show a debt that was designed to produce a specific outcome." She stood very still. "What outcome?" she said, and she already knew, but she needed him to say it because the distance between knowing something and hearing it said out loud was the distance between a suspicion and a fact, and she dealt in facts. "You," Luca said. "The arrangement. He needed a reason to bring someone into my house who would be close to me, who I would feel responsible for, who I would expose myself for. And he needed a mechanism to create that reason that I couldn't trace back to him." He paused. Walter Reed was not chosen randomly. His financial history was identified, cultivated, used, and when the debt reached the right number, Vescari brought it to my attention himself. He recommended the arrangement. The room was very quiet. Savannah looked at the financial records on the desk. She thought about her father's kitchen table that morning, 6 weeks ago now, his hands shaking around his coffee mug. She thought about a man who had spent 30 years making bad choices and believing the next one would fix them. She thought about how that kind of man was exactly the kind of man someone like Vescari would find useful. Someone already in debt, already desperate, already carrying enough genuine failure that the manufactured numbers would simply look like one more accumulation of consequence. She thought about herself, walking into that living room, stepping between Luca's men and her father, saying the words. The thing that happened inside her then was not quite anger. Anger was too simple, too immediate. This was something with more architecture to it, a cold and precise fury that organized itself around a specific understanding. She had been used. Her father had been used. The sacrifice she had made, the calculation she had accepted, the contract she had signed, all of it had been engineered from outside. She had walked into a room and made the bravest decision of her life, and the room itself had been a stage set. "He's going to use Walter," she said. Her voice was very level. "That's why they took him. Not to pressure you through me. To pressure you through Walter, through me. He wants you to come to him." "Yes. And you can't go through official channels. Whatever he's built financially, if law enforcement gets involved before you can control the disclosure, it exposes everything," Luca said. My organization, my operations, every person who works inside this structure. Yes. She looked at him. You've known for 4 months that someone inside was moving against you. You built a file. Why didn't you move faster? Because I needed the full shape of it, he said. Because moving against an underboss without complete evidence creates a war inside the organization that is harder to contain than the original problem. And now he's moved first. Yes, because of me. Because bringing me in accelerated his timeline. Luca looked at her with something that moved through his face too quickly to fully catch. Something that was close to the expression people wore in the ER when they understood that a decision they'd made in good faith had produced damage they couldn't undo. Yes, he said. She picked up the folder from the desk. She started reading. Savannah. Give me 10 minutes, she said. I read fast. He was quiet. He let her read. She went through it in 8 minutes. Not completely, not every page, but enough. She understood the mechanism by which Viscari had built the false debt. She understood which financial channels he'd used. She understood the timeline. And on the third to last page, she found something that Luca may not have registered as significant, because he didn't have her specific frame of reference. This account number, she said. She put her finger on a line. This is where the layered funds consolidated before they were redistributed. That's a business account, shell company. We haven't been able to identify the registered Meridian Capital Holdings, she said. That's who the company is registered to. He stared at her. How do you know that? Because 6 months ago, a man came into my ER with a cardiac event. He had his wallet on him, and I inventoried his personal effects and put them in the safe, and his business card said Meridian Capital Holdings. The name stuck because it sounded like a pharmaceutical company, and I thought it was funny. She set the folder down. His name was on the card. I don't remember the last name, but his first name was Thomas, and he had a tattoo on his left forearm. A compass rose. Luca moved before she'd finished the sentence. He picked up his phone and was talking before it reached his ear, and this call was nothing like the previous ones. Faster, lower, in a tone that she understood now was what he sounded like when the carefully maintained surface was no longer the priority. She listened to half of it before she stopped trying to parse the specifics and instead focused on reading the room, which was what she did when the situation moved faster than her ability to process individual data points. She cataloged, Luca on his feet now, pacing the short distance between the desk and the window, one hand in his hair. The first time she'd seen him touch his own face with anything other than deliberate control. The folder open on the desk. Her father's name on a document he'd never signed in a transaction he'd never understood. Luca ended the call. He stood at the window with his back to her. Thomas Cray, he said. He's Viscari's outside connection. The money that came out of your father's company went through Cray's shell structure and into accounts that Viscari has been building for 3 years. It's a war chest. He turned. He's not just trying to remove me. He's trying to fund a replacement operation. Full transition of power. How much? Enough, Luca said. Enough to buy loyalty from people I thought were mine and establish independent supply chains and operate without anything I built. He paused. This has been in motion for 3 years. She sat down on the edge of the nearest chair. Not because her legs were giving out, they weren't, but because the information required a different posture, required her to stop moving and let it settle into the shape it was going to take. 3 years. The file had been built for 4 months. Viscari had been building for 3 years. He had been 9 months ahead of discovery the entire time, and every month Luca hadn't found it was another month of architecture going up. Walls, floors, exits, escape routes, until the structure was solid enough to withstand exposure. He's going to send a message, she said, about my father. He'll wait until morning. He'll want you off balance, and he'll want you to come to him, and he'll want to control the conditions. Yes. So we have whatever time is left between now and morning. Luca looked at her. We. Don't do that, she said. Don't act like I'm not inside this. My father is inside this. He was put there to get to you, and I was put there to get to you, and all of that is Viscari. So yes, we. Luca was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with that expression that she'd cataloged and could now almost name. It was the expression of a man who spent his entire life operating in a world where the word We had precise and bounded meaning, where partnership was always a calculation, where trust was always provisional, and who was finding that provisional insufficient for the current situation. He sat on the edge of the desk. He rubbed the side of his face with one hand. "The evidence in this file," she said. "Is it enough?" "For what?" "For federal prosecution. If you handed it over." He looked at her. "I know what that means for you," she said. "I know what exposure looks like from your position. I'm asking if the file is enough because it's a variable in the calculation, and I need to know what variables we have." "If the file were complete," he said carefully, "and if the Thomas Cray connection can be documented, and if we can establish the chain between Viscari and the Meridian accounts, then yes, it would be significant." "What's missing?" "The transfers from the last 6 weeks. Viscari moved money after he took Walter, well, probably the final consolidation before he intends to act. I don't have documentation of that movement yet." "Where would that documentation be?" He paused. "Viscari's private office. He has a facility, a building on the industrial waterfront he's maintained separately from my operations. I've known about it peripherally. I didn't understand what it was for until—" He stopped. Reset. "Until recently." "The steel mill," she said. "Or something like it?" "Near the waterfront, yes." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the phone call, the breathing on the other end. Her father in a room somewhere in this city, 63 years old with a bad back and 30 years of bad decisions behind him, and no understanding of how deeply he'd been embedded in something he'd never chosen to be part of. "What time is it?" she said. 2:47? "When will Viscari expect you to reach out?" "He'll contact me first, by 6. He'll want to control the initiation." "So we have 3 hours." "Savannah!" She stood. She looked at him directly, in the way she looked at attending physicians when they were being careful with her in ways she didn't need. "I'm not going to fall apart," she said. "I'm not going to do anything that makes this harder. But I need you to understand that I am not a variable in your calculation. I'm not a pressure point, and I'm not a liability, and I'm not something you need to manage. My father was used to manufacture a situation, and I walked into it, and now he's being held somewhere on this waterfront, and I have a name that connects your underboss to a financial structure you couldn't previously identify. I am a resource. Use me like one." The silence in the room was different from every other silence she'd experienced in this house. It had a different quality, not the silence of a man withholding or calculating or deciding how much to give. Something more than that. Something that looked almost like a man who had spent 11 years in a room with people who either feared him or needed him, or wanted something from him, encountering a different kind of person for the first time, and not yet knowing what to do with the encounter. He reached back to the desk. He picked up his phone. He held it toward her. "Call your contact at the hospital," he said. "The one who took the message at the nurse's station. I need a physical description of whoever delivered it." She took the phone. She looked at him. "It's 3 a.m, she said. "I know." She called. Her colleague answered on the 4th ring, groggy and confused, and Savannah kept it brief and clinical, and apologized for the hour in exactly the way that communicated that the apology was genuine, but the information was more urgent than the apology. She got the description. Male, mid-40s, heavy through the shoulders, a scar along the left jawline, spoke with a slight accent she'd described as Eastern European, and she repeated it to Luca while she was still on the phone. She saw his face change. She thanked her colleague and ended the call and looked at Luca. "You know who that is," she said. "His name is Petrov," Luca said. "He's been with Viscari for 6 years. I thought he was—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "I thought he was mine." She handed the phone back. Outside the window, Chicago was doing what Chicago did at 3 a.m. in late winter, sitting under a low gray sky with the lake wind moving through the empty streets, patient and indifferent, the way the city always was, the way it would continue to be, regardless of what happened inside this room or inside whatever building Viscari was using on the waterfront. Her phone lit up on the desk where she'd set it down. Unknown number. She picked it up. She looked at Luca. He nodded once. She answered. Viscari's voice was exactly as she remembered it from the dinner. Warm, measured, the voice of a man who understood the value of sounding reasonable. "Ms. Reed?" he said. "I hope I didn't wake you." She said nothing. "I have someone here who'd like to speak with you," Viscari said, "just to confirm he's comfortable. We've been very hospitable." There was a shuffling sound. Then her father's voice. Not steady, not even close to steady, but present, which was the only thing that mattered. "Savvy." Walter's voice, compressed, trying. "Dad," she said, "are you hurt?" No, I'm okay. The line transferred back. "He's fine," Viscari said pleasantly. "For now, he's fine. I'd like to speak with Luca. Put him on." She held the phone toward Luca. He took it without looking at her and brought it to his ear and said nothing for a moment, and then, "Damien." Whatever Viscari said on the other end was inaudible to her. She watched Luca's face. She watched what happened to it during the 30 seconds he listened. The progressive, controlled erasure of every surface expression until what remained was something she couldn't read, something that had gone past the level of face into something underneath, something older and harder, and with no performance left in it at all. "I'll come," Luca said, "alone." Another pause. "I know where it is." He ended the call. He set her phone back on the desk. He stood very still for a moment, and she thought she understood what was happening. The same thing that happened to her at the end of a shift when a patient was lost. That 3-second gap between the moment the monitor flatlined and the moment her hands started moving. The moment when the body processed the shift in reality before the professional response could take over. Then he turned to the bookshelf and began pulling binders. "What did he say?" she said. 6 a.m. The waterfront facility. Luca set the binders on the desk without looking up. "Come alone. Or he hurts Walter." "And you said yes." "I said yes." She looked at him. "You're not going alone." "I told him I would." "I know what you told him." She crossed to the desk and put her hand flat on the binders he was pulling. Not hard, just present, stopping the motion. He looked up. She held his eyes. "You said I was a resource." "I meant it. Use me like one. Because if you walk into that building alone with no documentation and no secondary position, you don't walk out, and neither does my father, and the file on this desk means nothing, because Viscari will have had 3 hours to make it disappear." Luca looked at her hand on the binders. He looked at her face. And for the first time since she had knocked on his door 40 minutes ago, something shifted in his expression that was not controlled, not calculated, not the product of a man managing his own reaction, something that was simply human. He stepped back from the desk. He looked at the window. He looked at the file. He looked at his hands for a moment in the way of a man taking inventory of what he actually had available to him, stripping away everything strategic and everything performed until he was left with the raw count. Then he looked at her. "Sit down," he said. "We have 3 hours. Tell me everything you remember about the layout of every building you've seen on Chicago's industrial waterfront. Every entrance, every sightline, every structural detail." She sat down. They worked until 5:15. The plan was not elegant. Elegant plans required time and resources and the luxury of controlled conditions, none of which they had. What they built in 3 hours at Luca's desk was something closer to a pressure calculation. If you apply force here, the structure fails there, and when it fails, you move through the gap before it closes. She provided the architectural logic, the spatial reasoning, the clinical assessment of human physical limits under stress. He provided everything else. The personnel he could trust, the 2 names he was certain of after 4 months of building the file, and the specific geography of the waterfront facility, which he knew because he had stood outside it once, 8 months ago, before he understood what it was. Carver was one of the 2 names. The other was a man called Reyes, who arrived at the house at 4:30 without being told what he was walking into, and stood in the office doorway and looked at Luca and said, "How bad?" And Luca said, "Bad enough." And Reyes said, "Okay." And that was the entire conversation. She watched that exchange and understood something she hadn't fully understood before about the kind of loyalty that existed in rooms like this. Not the loyalty of men who agreed with each other, not the loyalty of shared ideology or mutual benefit, but the loyalty of men who had stood in enough bad rooms together that the room itself was sufficient information. At 5:40, Luca looked at her across the desk. You stay in the car, he said. That is not negotiable, and it is not a reflection of what I think you're capable of. It is a structural requirement. If something goes wrong inside, you are the only person who knows the complete shape of the evidence file. You call the number I gave you, and you give them the file location, and you do not go inside for any reason. She looked at him. And my father? Reyes goes in for Walter the moment Viscari's attention is on me. That's the sequence. If the sequence breaks, then we adapt. He held her eyes. But you stay in the car. She wanted to argue. She looked at his face and understood that this was one of those moments where the argument itself would cost more than the concession, and she said, if I hear gunshots and nothing comes out in 4 minutes, I'm coming in. He looked at her for a long moment. 3 minutes, he said. She almost said something. Instead, she nodded. They left at 5:50. The waterfront in the hour before dawn was the most honest version of Chicago. Stripped of the daytime performance, just concrete and water and the smell of the lake in winter, iron cold and faintly biological, the smell of something very large and very indifferent. Carver drove without headlights for the last quarter mile, which told her he'd done this kind of navigation before. The facility appeared out of the gray dark as a mass first, a long, low building, former industrial, the kind of structure that had been built to house something heavy and mechanical and had outlasted the thing it was built for. Broken skylights along the roofline, a loading dock on the south face, lights inside, visible through the gaps in the exterior panels. Carver stopped the car 200 yards back, behind a row of shipping containers that blocked the sightline from the building. Luca turned to her from the front seat. He didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at his face in the gray pre-dawn light and thought that this was the face without anything over it. Not the composure, not the control, not the social surface that a man in his position required as basic equipment. Just the face, angular and imperfect and very present. The file is in the desk, he said. 3rd drawer. The combination to the lock is... Don't, she said. He stopped. Don't give me the combination, she said, because I'm not going to need it. Come back and give it to me yourself. He looked at her. She held his eyes and did not look away, and did not qualify the statement, because qualification was a form of preparation for failure, and she was not preparing for failure. He said, very quietly, okay. He got out. Reyes got out. Carver stayed. She watched them cross the dark ground toward the building, Luca moving with the deliberate economy of a man who had done dangerous things before and understood that urgency and speed were not the same thing, Reyes half a step behind and to his left. And then the dark swallowed them, and they were gone. She looked at her phone. 5:58. She counted her own heartbeat. It was elevated, not panic, not fear exactly, but the particular biological honesty of a body that understands it is in proximity to something that could kill the people it has decided matter. She had felt this before. In the ER, when a patient was coding and the outcome was genuinely uncertain and the next 60 seconds were the only thing that existed. She knew how to sit inside this feeling without it dismantling her. She sat inside it. Carver was watching the building through the windshield with the same quality of attention he brought to driving. Total, unpretentious, functional. He had one hand on the steering wheel and one hand somewhere she couldn't see, and she understood without looking that the hand she couldn't see was holding something. "How long have you worked for him?" she said. Not because she needed to know, because the silence was a kind of pressure that wasn't useful. 9 years, Carver said. He didn't look at her. "You know Viscari?" "Yeah." "Did you suspect him?" A pause. Long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "I suspected something. Didn't have the shape of it." Another pause. "Should have pushed harder." She looked at the building. A light moved inside. Visible through a gap in the panels, a shifting warm glow, someone moving with a handheld source. One person. Then another. Her phone said 6:02. Inside the building, Luca walked through a side entrance that Reyes had identified from a previous surveillance pass, a personnel door on the east face, padlocked from outside, which meant it hadn't been used recently and wasn't being watched. He'd cut the lock in the dark in 4 seconds. which was the kind of practiced efficiency that Savannah, had she been watching, would have noted without surprise. The interior of the building was what abandoned industrial spaces always were, vast in a way that felt aggressive, the ceiling lost in darkness above the ambient light sources, the floor a geography of defunct machinery and accumulated shadow. The furnaces at the far end were dead, but present, massive cylindrical shapes that rose from the floor like monuments to a function nobody performed anymore. Catwalks ran above at 2 levels. Chains hung from overhead rigging. The whole space smelled of rust and old heat, and the specific mineral cold of a building that hadn't been properly enclosed in years. Vescari had established himself at the center of the space. He was standing at a metal table, the kind of folding table that appeared in warehouses and construction sites, purely utilitarian, with 2 men flanking him and a laptop open in front of him, and Walter Reed sitting in a chair to his left. Walter was zip-tied at the wrists, and his face was marked on the left side. Someone had hit him, not recently. The bruising was already developed, meaning it had happened hours ago. And he was looking at the ground with the expression of a man who had moved beyond fear into a kind of exhausted waiting. Petrov was there, standing to Vescari's right, the scar along his jaw visible even from the distance at which Luca stopped. 3 other men at the perimeter that Luca counted without appearing to look. He had come in through the east and Reyes had gone wide to the south, and the timing between them was the most fragile element of the entire calculation. Too early, and Vescari's attention would go to Walter before Reyes reached him. Too late, and the negotiation would have already moved past the point where position mattered. Vescari heard him, turned. The smile on Vescari's face was the same smile from the dinner, warm, genuine seeming, the smile of a man who understood that the performance had to hold even when the performance was no longer necessary. Even now, even here. He smiled like a man hosting an event. "Luca," he said, his voice carried cleanly across the concrete space. "I wasn't sure you'd come alone." Luca walked toward him, even pace, hands visible. "You asked me to," Luca said. "I did." Vescari glanced past him, checking the entrance, the perimeter, then back. "You look tired. Did you sleep?" "No." "Me either." Vescari closed the laptop. He was wearing a different suit than the dinner, something darker, and he looked precisely as composed as he always did, which Luca was now understanding was not composure at all, but armor. You didn't maintain that surface through 3 years of systematic betrayal through composure. You maintained it through something colder. "How much do you know?" "Enough." "Be specific." Meridian Capital, Thomas Cray, 37 months of redirected funds through the Reed account structure. Luca stopped 10 feet from the table. The war chest. Something moved in Vescari's expression. Not surprise. He'd anticipated that Luca would know something, had architected the situation to reach this conversation regardless of what Luca knew. What moved in his expression was assessment, recalculating. "More than I expected," Vescari said, "but not complete. Because if it were complete, you wouldn't have come. You'd have used it." "Maybe I wanted to talk first." "You don't want to talk," Vescari said pleasantly. "You want your nurse's father back, and you want to walk out of here with enough intact to maintain what you've built, both of which I understand." He moved around the table, not threatening, almost conversational. 11 years, Luca. I know exactly what you want." "Then give me Walter," Luca said, "and we negotiate." "Negotiate," Vescari said the word as though testing its texture. "That's not really where we are, is it? We're past negotiation. We've been past it for, honestly, probably 2 years. I just needed the conditions to be right before I said so out loud." Luca looked at Walter. Walter had raised his head. He was looking at Luca with an expression that was difficult to read from this distance. Not quite hope, not quite desperation, something between them that a man arrived at after a very long night in a cold building. "What do you want?" Luca said. "Everything," Vescari said simply and without drama. "What you built, what you run, the structure, the relationships, the routes, all of it. And I want you to facilitate the transition before this is over. Because the way this works depends entirely on whether the handoff is clean or chaotic, and I think you're smart enough to prefer clean." And if I don't? Viscari's pleasant expression did not change. He nodded once, slightly, and Petrov moved. Walter made a sound, not a word, the involuntary sound of someone whose chair has been grabbed from behind. And Petrov had his hand in Walter's collar, and Walter's head was pulled back, and the angle was exactly what it was designed to be, which was an argument without words. Luka's hands stayed where they were. Inside his chest, behind the controlled surface, something was happening that he hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, not quite, but the physiological awareness of a man who has just watched his options reduced to a number small enough to count. He was thinking about Reyes. He was calculating time. He was holding the controlled surface with everything available to him, and beneath it he was thinking about a woman in a car 200 yards away who had put her hand flat on his binders at 3 a.m. and said, "Use me like one," with the same voice she probably used when someone was dying on her table. "All right," Luka said. "Walk me through it." Viscari blinked, just slightly. "The transition," Luka said. "Walk me through what you need from me and in what sequence. If we're doing this, I want to understand the scope." Viscari looked at him. This was not the response he'd planned for. Not resistance, not an attempt to stall, but apparent cooperation, which was more suspicious than defiance. Luka could see him recalibrating, could see the warm social surface flickering as the calculation underneath it ran. "Start with the eastern distribution contacts," Viscari said carefully. The south wall came in." Not literally. Reyes didn't come through the wall. But the personnel door on the south face opened fast and hard, and the sound of it in the concrete space was loud enough to function as a weapon, loud enough to break attention, and in the 2 seconds that every eye in the room went to the south wall, Luka moved. 10 feet to the table. He hit Viscari at the shoulder rather than the face. A choice. Deliberate. Designed to take him down without taking him out, because an unconscious Viscari was a Viscari who couldn't be made to talk on record. And Viscari went into the table edge, and the laptop came down with him. Petrov released Walter. He turned toward Luka. Luka was already moving, and what happened in the next 40 seconds was not clean and was not choreographed and looked nothing like the kind of violence that gets described in clean lines. Because real violence in an enclosed concrete space is chaotic and loud and involves a great deal of impact against surfaces that do not yield. Petrov was large, and he was trained, and the scar on his jaw was not decorative. It was history. It was evidence of a man who had been in enough of these situations that he developed the specific muscle memory of someone who survived them. He caught Luka across the left ear with an elbow, and the world went white at the edges for a moment. Luka hit the floor on one knee. Petrov came down over him. From the south, Reyes had reached Walter. She heard it later, reconstructed it from what Reyes told her, how Walter had been on his feet before Reyes got to him, because 63-year-old men with bad decisions behind them and daughters in cars outside apparently retain a certain velocity when sufficiently motivated. And they were moving toward the east entrance, which was the sequence, which was the plan. On the floor, Luka caught Petrov's next strike on his forearm and used the contact to redirect rather than absorb it, and came up with his elbow into the underside of Petrov's jaw and heard the sound that made, and Petrov sat down. Viscari was back up. He was bleeding from the eyebrow where he'd hit the table edge, and the warm social surface was gone entirely now. And what Luka saw in his face, for the first time in 11 years, was the actual man. Not the warmth, not the charm, not the performance of loyalty and collegiality and shared history. Just a man who had decided 11 years ago that what Luka had built should belong to him and had spent 37 months constructing the mechanism to take it, and who was now standing in a cold industrial building watching the mechanism malfunction. "You came with someone," Viscari said. His voice was different, stripped. "I came with exactly who you asked me to come with," Luka said. He straightened. His left ear was ringing. He could feel something wrong along his left ribs from where he'd hit the floor. Not broken, maybe, but present. Pain is information. He filed it. "You specified alone. Reyes doesn't count as someone. He's infrastructure." Around them, Viscari's remaining men had converged. 2 of them. The third was on the floor near the east wall, in a way that suggested Reyes had been efficient on the way in. 2 men with weapons drawn, angled, covering the space between Luca and the exit. Viscari looked at them, looked at Luca. "You're not walking out of here," Viscari said. "Neither are you," Luca said. "Not the way you planned. I have 2 men with guns pointed at you, and I have 37 months of documented financial transactions that are currently in a location you don't know, with a person you underestimated who has a phone and a number to call." Luca looked at him steadily. "Move against me and the call gets made, and everything you built for 3 years becomes the evidence that ends your life as you understand it." Viscari's jaw was tight. The blood from his eyebrow had reached his cheekbone, and he wasn't bothering to wipe it. They stood 10 feet apart in the cold light of a dead industrial space, and the 2 men with guns were the only sound in the room, their breathing and the faint creak of the catwalk above from the draft that came through the broken skylights. "You don't have it," Viscari said. "You don't have the full picture. You said yourself, 'I have Thomas Cray,'" Luca said. "I have Meridian Capital. I have 37 months, and I have a witness who can place Cray in a specific location on a specific date and describe his identifying marks in detail sufficient for a federal identification." He paused. "The last piece was the last piece, Damien. You needed 3 years to build it. It took her 8 minutes to find it." Something crossed Viscari's face at the hear, something that moved beneath the stripped surface and was uglier than anything else she'd seen in this room. "The nurse," he said. "She's not here," Luca said. "She's somewhere safe." In the car, Savannah was not somewhere safe. She was 200 yards away with her hand on the door handle and her phone in the other hand, and her eyes on the building, and the count in her head had passed 4 minutes and then 5. And she had made the decision at 4.5, and the only thing stopping her was the faint sound she'd heard at the 3.5-minute mark, something large and impactful from inside the building, followed by silence of a different quality than the silence before it. A different quality. Not the silence of nothing happening, the silence of something having happened. She was still counting. Her phone lit up. Not the number Luca had given her for the federal contact. Not her father's number. Not Luca. A message from an unknown number. A single image. A photograph taken with a long lens of a car parked behind a row of shipping containers 200 yards from a waterfront building. Of her. In the car. Sitting exactly where she was sitting. She looked up from the phone. She looked at the shipping containers on either side of the car. She looked at Carver in the front seat, who had not moved, who was still watching the building, who... "Carver," she said. He turned. She held up the phone. He looked at the image. His face changed. He reached for his door. But the window on his side was already going, and the sound it made was not glass breaking, but something worse. The specific compressed crack of a window struck by something traveling very fast. And Carver's head went forward, and he was still, and the car was very quiet, and Savannah had exactly the time it took for her brain to process what had just happened to make the only decision available to. She was out of the car before the decision finished forming. Not through the door Carver had reached for. That side was exposed, was where the shot had come from, and her body understood this before her mind caught up, and she went out the passenger side low and fast and hit the ground behind the rear wheel well, and stayed there. The gravel was wet and cold through her jeans. She pressed her back against the car and breathed through her nose and listened. 1 shot, 1. Which meant 1 shooter probably, and 1 shooter with a long gun was a specific problem with a specific solution. You denied him the angle. She was behind the car. He was somewhere to the north, somewhere elevated given the trajectory, which meant the shipping containers to her left were the wrong direction, and the open ground ahead of her toward the building was the only ground that changed the geometry. She looked at Carver. Through the passenger window, through the spiderweb damage of the glass, she could see him slumped forward. Still. She could not tell from this angle whether still meant dead or still meant unconscious. She filed it. She could not help him from here. She could not help anyone from here. She ran. Not upright. She ran the way she'd seen exactly no one run in real life outside of combat footage. Low and angled, using the cars and containers for cover in a broken line that gave a stationary shooter the worst possible target geometry. She was not trained for this. She was trained to move through a trauma bay with 4 things happening simultaneously, and to keep her hands steady and her voice flat and her mind parsing information faster than she could consciously process it, and it turned out that those skills translated, imperfectly and at great cost to her heart rate, into moving across open ground under the threat of a rifle. She reached the building's east wall breathing like she'd sprinted a mile. The personnel door Luca had come through was still open. 3 inches. She pushed through it and was inside, and the sudden shift from the gray pre-dawn exterior to the interior light made her eyes work hard for 2 seconds that felt longer. She took in the room in pieces, the way she took in a trauma scene. Not the whole picture, the immediate foreground first, the threats, the positions. Vescari, standing, bleeding from the eyebrow, jacket torn at the shoulder. Alive. 2 men with weapons, one covering the east wall. Covering her now, the gun coming around the moment she entered. The other fixed on Luca. Luca. On his feet, a gash along his jaw that was bleeding steadily down his neck. Left hand pressed against his side. His eyes found her the moment she came through the door, and something moved through them. That was not relief exactly, because the situation did not yet permit relief, but was adjacent to it. The specific look of a man who has been calculating based on the assumption that a variable is lost and has just discovered the variable is not lost. Walter. She found him next. Near the south wall, on his feet, zip ties gone from his wrists. Reyes had cut them, standing beside Reyes, who had his arm across Walter's chest in the posture of a man holding someone back from doing something inadvisable. Walter was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, and hoped never to see again. Petrov. On the ground near the furnaces, not moving. One of Vescari's original perimeter men, on the floor near the east wall. The third, she'd counted 3 originally, was not visible, and that absence was a specific problem. The man covering her said, "Stop." She stopped. Vescari turned to look at her. The blood on his face had dried to a line, and his expression when he looked at her was something she recognized belatedly as the look she'd seen at the dinner. The peripheral attention, the assessment, but without the warmth over it now, without anything over it. "The nurse," he said. "You drove yourself." "Carver's down," she said. She kept her voice flat. She was looking at Luca. "There's a shooter outside. North position, elevated." Luca absorbed this without changing his expression. His left hand was still pressed to his side. "How bad?" she said to him. "I'm standing," he said. "That's not what I asked." "It's what I have," he said. Vescari had been watching this exchange with the expression of someone recalibrating. She could see him doing it, updating his model, adjusting for the presence of a variable he'd underestimated, the way she adjusted her assessment when a patient's presentation changed. She could also see, in the peripheral awareness she'd been running the entire time she'd been in this building, that the man covering Luca had shifted his angle slightly when she came in. Small movement, but angles mattered. "You said she'd be somewhere safe," Vescari said to Luca. "She made a different decision," Luca said. "She made a very stupid decision." "She's still standing," Luca said. "Same as me." Vescari looked at her. "The file. The evidence your husband has been building. Where is it?" "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. He moved fast for a man who had been thrown into a table edge 20 minutes ago. 2 steps, and his hand was in her collar, and the gun from one of his men was suddenly the ambient fact of the room, present in everyone's awareness in a new way. She felt the grip through her jacket, through the shirt underneath, felt the faint tremor in it that told her something she filed immediately. He was running on adrenaline and anger, and the specific energy of a plan that was not resolving the way it was designed to resolve, which meant he was not fully controlled, which meant he was more dangerous in some directions and less dangerous in others. "The file," he said. "Close now." She could smell blood and expensive cologne, and underneath both of them, the sweat of a man under extreme pressure. "The location." She looked at him. She kept her face exactly as flat as she kept it when a patient's family was screaming at her in a corridor. "If I tell you where it is," she said, "you have no reason to let any of us out of here." His grip tightened. "Damien." Luca's voice. Quiet. The same voice he used for everything. The voice that had no register below controlled, except that now there was something under the control that she could hear even from across the room. Something with mass and heat to it. Something that the control was costing real effort to maintain. Let her go. Give me the location, Viscari said to her. Not to Luca, to her. She looked past Viscari's shoulder at Luca. Luca was looking back at her. In the industrial light of the dead building, with blood on his jaw and his hand pressed to his side, and 11 years of betrayal standing between him and the man who'd committed it, he looked at her with the expression she'd been cataloging since the first night, and could now, finally, name. It was the expression of a man who had stopped calculating. She looked at Viscari. Second drawer, she said. His desk. The combination is his mother's birth year followed by the day the organization was formally established. You don't know either number. Viscari stared at her. You'd need him alive to get in, she said. And you'd need me alive to verify what you're looking at when you do, because I'm the one who read the whole file, and I'm the one who can identify the Cray connection from a documented account I personally witnessed. She held his eyes. So let's talk about what you actually need from this room and what your real options are, because the shooter outside is a liability, not an asset. One shot, one sound, in a waterfront district at 6 in the morning means someone is already calling someone, and whatever window you had is getting smaller. The room held. She could hear her own pulse in her ears. She could hear Walter breathing from across the room, the elevated, effortful breathing of a man who had been awake all night in a cold building with his hands tied. She could hear the wind through the broken skylights above, moving through the dead space of the catwalk. Viscari released her collar. He stepped back. He looked at her and then at Luca, and something shifted in his face. Not defeat, not yet, but the specific expression of a man who has been running a play for 3 years and has just watched the play reach a moment it wasn't designed for. You're not what I planned for, he said. To her, almost conversational. No, she said. He looked at Luca. You should have stayed predictable. You should have stayed loyal, Luca said. Viscari looked at him for a long moment. Whatever passed between them in that look was 11 years of something she hadn't been present for. The shared history of men who had built something together, who had stood in bad rooms together before this bad room, who had trusted each other with things that mattered, and the specific weight of what it meant when that history resolved into this, into a cold building, into blood on both their faces. Then Viscari reached inside his jacket, not for a weapon. She registered this immediately, registered that his hand came out holding a phone, not a gun, which was either the most rational decision he'd made all morning or the most dangerous one depending on what the phone was for. Marco, he said into it. Stand down. A pause. Stand down, he said again, flat. He lowered the phone. He looked at the two men still holding weapons and made a gesture, 2 fingers down. And they lowered the guns with the mechanical compliance of men who followed instruction regardless of whether they understood it. She didn't relax. She watched Viscari. He put the phone in his jacket pocket. He straightened his jacket in the specific way of a man who does not know what to do with his hands and has defaulted to something habitual. He looked at Luca. The Cray connection, he said. If you have that documented, I have it documented, Luca said. Then you always had enough. I had enough, Luca said. When she found Cray's name in a file I'd been building for 4 months. Yes. Viscari looked at the floor. He looked at the furnaces behind him, the massive dead cylinders of a process that had been over for decades. He looked like a man who had just felt the full weight of 3 years come down on him at once and was discovering that it was heavier than he'd estimated. What happens now? He said. Now, Luca said. We finish this. What happened in the next 40 minutes was not dramatic. Drama required uncertainty, and the outcome of the next 40 minutes had been determined before they began, by the file in the desk drawer, by the number on Savannah's phone, by 4 months of documentation and 8 minutes of medical records memory, and 1 name on a business card belonging to a man who'd had a cardiac event on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. Reyes made a call. Luca made a call. The federal contact whose number Savannah had memorized answered on the second ring despite the hour, which told her the hour had been anticipated. The information transferred in the clean, precise language of people who had been waiting for specific information and were now receiving it. She sat with Walter. She sat beside him on the concrete floor with her back against the south wall and his shoulder against hers, and she did not say anything about the debt, or the business, or the 9 years of manufactured obligation that had led to this building. She didn't say anything about Viscari's 3 years, or Luca's 4 months, or the photograph she'd found under her car door, or the post-it at the nurse's station. None of that was useful right now. She put her arm around her father's shoulders and felt how cold he was, and took off her jacket and put it over his, and sat. Walter said, after a long time, "I didn't know." "I know," she said. "The company. I had no idea what was moving through it. I never—" "Dad." She squeezed his shoulder once. "I know." He was quiet. Then, "Your mother used to say I had a gift for standing in the wrong place at the wrong time." "She wasn't wrong," Savannah said. Walter made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. Carver was alive. She found this out when Reyes went back to the car and came back with the information. The shot had taken the window and grazed Carver's skull, a wound that would require surgery and a considerable period of recovery, but was survivable, which was the only category that mattered. An ambulance was already coming. She'd made sure of that in the first call before anything else because triage was triage regardless of the setting. She watched Luca while she sat with Walter. He was across the room, standing, still pressing his hand to his left side, speaking on the phone in the low, controlled voice she now knew as his working voice. He hadn't sat down. She understood that. Sitting down when the adrenaline was still running was a concession the body asked for, and a concession that would cost him, and he knew it, and he was making the choice to stay vertical until the situation was closed enough to permit the cost. She registered, without analyzing it yet, that she was worried about him, not as a clinical observation, as something else, something she hadn't scheduled and didn't have a category for. Viscari was zip-tied in the chair Walter had vacated, which had a particular geometry to it that she supposed meant something to both men, and Petrov was zip-tied beside him, and the 2 remaining men were similarly restrained by Reyes with the efficiency of someone who had done exactly this before. The man called Marco, the shooter from outside, walked in through the east entrance 12 minutes after Viscari's call with his hands visible and his rifle slung and his face carrying the expression of someone who had assessed the situation and reached the correct conclusion about his options. By the time the first federal vehicles arrived at 7:14, the building was quiet. The weeks that followed were not quiet. They were the specific chaos of a large structure failing, not collapsing, not disintegrating, but failing, which is different, which involves a great deal of controlled demolition and careful documentation and the negotiated dismantling of things that had been built over years. The federal case that assembled itself around the Meridian Capital evidence was, she was told by the contact whose name she still didn't know, one of the more thorough financial crime prosecutions the relevant office had processed in a decade. The Cray connection opened 3 additional investigations. Viscari's war chest, which had taken 37 months to build, took 11 days to fully account for and freeze. Thomas Cray was arrested at O'Hare. He had a compass rose tattoo on his left forearm and a business card that read, Meridian Capital Holdings, and he looked, when Savannah saw his photograph in the documentation she was asked to verify, exactly like a man who had been brought in for a cardiac event on a Tuesday and had his personal effects inventoried by a nurse whose memory was very good. Walter Reed was interviewed 3 times by federal investigators and cooperated fully and was ultimately not charged with anything because his role in the Meridian structure was exactly what Luca had described, unwitting, a vehicle, a man whose genuine financial distress had been identified and cultivated by someone who needed a specific shape of failure to work with. She sat with him through 2 of the 3 interviews. She watched him answer questions about his company, his borrowing, his understanding of the accounts that had been run through his business for years without his knowledge, and she watched his face as he understood, incrementally, and then all at once, the full scope of what had been built around him. He looked, by the end of it, different. Not smaller. He had always run to a kind of hopeful expansiveness, the particular posture of a man who believed the next thing was going to be different, but more accurate. Like someone had adjusted the calibration. She didn't know if that was permanent or if the hopeful expansiveness would return with time, and she found that she was all right with not knowing. Some things you sat with. Luca's rib was cracked. 2 of them. She found this out when she finally got him to let her look at him, which happened 4 days after the waterfront in the kitchen of the Lincoln Park house. When he reached for something on a high shelf, and the controlled surface slipped for a fraction of a second, and she saw what he'd been not showing her since the building. She sat him down and she pressed along his rib cage with the professional detachment of someone who had been trained to assess this, and beneath the professional detachment she was aware, at some remove, of being angry at him for managing this for 4 days without telling her. "You should have gone to a hospital," she said. "I was busy," he said. 2 cracked ribs. "I've had worse." That's not a useful data point." She pressed on the second rib and felt him flinch without meaning to and noted the location. "You need imaging. You need to rule out pneumothorax." "Savannah." "What?" "I know," he said quietly. "I know I need imaging. I was going to go today." She looked at him. He was sitting at his own kitchen table in the middle of the morning with 2 cracked ribs he'd been ignoring for 4 days, and his hands flat on the surface, and his face doing the thing it did when the controlled surface was still present, but the effort of maintaining it was visible. She had his hands on his ribs and her face close to his, the clinical proximity of an assessment, and she was aware that the clinical proximity was the only kind they'd inhabited together, and that something about the current moment was different from that. "Luca," she said. He looked at her. "Go get the imaging," she said. "Then come back." He went. He came back. The imaging confirmed 2 cracked ribs and no pneumothorax, and the attending physician at the clinic he went to told him what Savannah had already told him, which was rest and breath work, and the kind of patience that is its own form of effort. He told her this when he came back. He stood in the kitchen doorway and delivered the information with the slightly rueful expression of a man reporting that someone who knew what they were talking about had, in fact, known what they were talking about. "Was that difficult?" she said. "Admitting I was right." "Moderately," he said. She almost smiled. She turned back to the counter. The contract had 107 weeks remaining. She thought about this sometimes. On the drive to the hospital, in the 4-second pause she still gave herself between one thing and the next. In the morning, when the house made its sounds, and she'd learned enough of them now that they'd stopped being foreign. The contract existed. She had signed it in her father's living room under specific conditions that had since been revealed to be partially manufactured, which raised a question she hadn't asked yet about whether the contract was valid, about whether the foundation it stood on was solid enough to hold its terms. She hadn't asked it because she hadn't been ready to hear the answer. She asked it on a Sunday in March, 3 months after the waterfront. Luca was in the office. She stood in the doorway, and he looked up from whatever he was reading, and she said, "The contract." He looked at her. "The debt it was written to address was fabricated," she said. "The conditions that produced it were engineered by someone whose intention was specifically to use me against you, which means the document was built on a false premise from the beginning." She held his eyes. "Is it valid?" Luca set down what he was reading. He was quiet for a moment. Then he opened the 3rd drawer, the one she'd described to Vescari in the warehouse, the one with the lock she'd told Vescari he couldn't open without Luca. And he took out the contract. He put it on the desk. He looked at it. She crossed the room. She stood on the other side of the desk. She looked at both their signatures on the last page, her handwriting and his, the amendment she'd written in the margin of page 7, the date, the hour. Luca reached into the drawer again. He took out a document she didn't recognize. Different paper, different format, not the contract. He put it beside the contract. "This is a legal dissolution," he said. "I had it prepared 6 weeks ago, in case you wanted it." She looked at it, then at him. 6 weeks ago," she said. "I didn't want to—" He stopped. Reset. This was a thing he did, she'd learned. When the first phrasing wasn't accurate enough, he stopped and found a better one, as though imprecision was a form of dishonesty he didn't permit himself. "I didn't want to offer it before you'd had time to understand what it meant. What both options meant." "Both options," she said. "The dissolution, or—" He stopped again. She watched him find the words, watched the controlled surface do the thing it did when something beneath it had more weight than the surface was designed to carry. "Or staying, not on contract, not because of a debt or an arrangement or a document with terms and termination clauses. Just staying. The room was quiet. Outside, Chicago was doing what it did in March, the first tentative loosening of the winter, not warm, not yet, but the quality of the light beginning to change, beginning to remember what it was before the cold. She looked at the contract. She looked at the dissolution. She looked at his hands flat on the desk, the same posture she'd seen him hold in the first hour she'd known him, across a coffee table in her father's living room, except that his hands were different to her now than they had been then. Not frightening, not foreign, but familiar in the way that things become familiar when you've learned their patterns. She picked up the contract. She tore it. Not dramatically. She didn't have the range for drama, had never had much patience for it, but cleanly, down the center, 2 halves. She set them on the desk. She looked at him. "The dissolution too," she said. He looked at her. "I don't need a document for staying," she said. "And I don't need a document for leaving. If I stay, I'll stay because I decide to, and if I leave, I'll leave because I decide to, and I'd like you to understand that those are the only terms I'm willing to operate under, not contracts, not arrangements, not anyone's fabricated debt." Luca was very still. She had learned his stillness. There was the professional stillness, the calculated kind, the stillness of a man controlling a room. This was different. This was the stillness of someone who had been moving underweight for a very long time and had just, for a moment, stopped. "I understand that," he said. "Good," she said. She picked up the dissolution and tore that too. She put all 4 pieces in the waste bin beside the desk. She straightened and looked at him. "Your ribs," she said. "You need to do the breathing exercises." "I've been doing them. Twice a day." "I know the prescription," he said. "You've told me. I'll keep telling you until you stop wincing when you reach for things." Something in his expression shifted, not the almost smile she'd catalogued from the early weeks. This was something more than that, something with more dimension, something that had been through enough with her that the surface of it was different than it had been before any of this happened. "Savannah," he said. "What?" "Thank you." She looked at him. She thought about her father's living room, the black SUVs outside, the document on the coffee table. She thought about a post-it at a nurse's station and a photograph under her car door and breathing on a phone line at 11:52 in the morning. She thought about a cold building on the waterfront and concrete under her knees and 2 cracked ribs that someone had managed for 4 days without telling her. "You can thank me," she said, "by doing the breathing exercises." She left the office. She went to the kitchen and started coffee and stood at the counter looking out at the back garden, which was showing the first tentative evidence of something returning, a line of green at the base of the dormant rose bushes, new growth, the season doing what it did without being asked or thanked for it. She heard him come in behind her. She didn't turn. She listened to him move through the kitchen. She knew the sound of him now, the weight and rhythm of it, the way you learned the sounds of a house until they were no longer foreign. And he stopped beside her at the counter and looked out at the garden, and she looked at it too, the 2 of them standing in the morning light of an ordinary Sunday, and for a long time neither of them said anything. Walter came for dinner the following Thursday. He brought wine he couldn't afford and spent the first 20 minutes being formally uncomfortable in the way of a man who understood he was standing in the home of someone he had complicated feelings about and wasn't sure of the protocol. Luca shook his hand and said, without fanfare or ceremony, "The legal costs from the federal proceedings have been covered. Your name is clean." And Walter looked at him for a moment and then looked at his shoes and then looked at Savannah with the expression she remembered from her childhood when he'd done something right, when the business was good or the decision had paid off before everything started falling apart. The expression of a man who had not expected to arrive somewhere like this. "Dinner's ready," she said. They ate. Walter told a story about the logistics company that made Luca ask one question and then another, and she watched her father settle into the conversation the way he settled into things when he thought someone was genuinely interested, the particular animation of a man who had spent a long time feeling like his life was a cautionary tale, being given permission to remember it as something else. She watched Luca listen to him. She watched the quality of his attention, the same quality she'd first registered across her father's living room, which had frightened her then and had since become something she understood differently. He listened the way he did everything, with complete focus, nothing performed, nothing wasted. Later, after Walter had gone, she stood at the kitchen sink and listened to the house settle into its night sounds. The third-floor boards, the refrigerator's particular frequency, the way the radiator in the hall expressed itself in cold weather. And Luca stood beside her and dried the dishes she washed, which was a domestic arrangement they had arrived at without discussion, and which struck her sometimes, in the midst of it, as the most unlikely outcome of a document signed in her father's living room at 4 a.m. She handed him the last plate. "He's going to be okay," she said. "About Walter." "Yes," Luca said. "I think so. He'll make mistakes." "Probably. He always does." She drained the sink. "But he comes back from them. He always has. Just slowly." Luca set the plate in the cabinet. He turned. He was close in the narrow kitchen, close enough that she could see the line the jaw cut was leaving. A scar, small, along the angle of his jaw that would be there permanently. She had looked at it clinically when she treated it, and now looked at it differently, the way she looked at things that were part of the landscape of a life she had decided to be in. "Savannah," he said. She looked up at him. "I know why you did it," he said. "That night, in your father's living room. I know it was for him and not—" He stopped, found the words. "I know it wasn't for me." "No," she said. "It wasn't. I know what you gave up to honor the contract. I know what it cost." She looked at him. "Do you want me to tell you it didn't cost anything?" "No," he said. "I want you to know I understand what it cost, and that I didn't understand it at first the way I understand it now." She thought about what she wanted to say to that. She thought about the distance between the man who had sat on her father's couch, with his hands flat on his knees, and offered a 12-page document, and the man standing in front of her in a kitchen on a Thursday night drying dishes after dinner with her father. The distance between those two things was everything that had happened, and everything that had happened had been, at various points, terrible and dangerous, and occasionally something else, something that didn't have a clean name, that existed in the specific texture of learning someone, of being in proximity to someone's actual self rather than the surface they presented to the world. "I know you understand it," she said. "That's why I stayed." He looked at her. In the kitchen light, with the scar on his jaw and the faint evidence of 2 cracked ribs, in the way he held himself slightly different than he had before, he looked like someone who had been through something and was on the other side of it and was still standing, which was, she had learned over years in emergency medicine, the only outcome that finally mattered. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, briefly, the way she did sometimes now, and felt him hold very still the way he always did when she touched him. Not reluctance, not distance, but the specific stillness of a man who was still learning that certain things were permitted, that the space between people could be a place where nothing was calculated or negotiated or contracted. Then she stepped back and turned off the kitchen light. "Come on," she said. "It's late." Outside, Chicago went on being Chicago, vast and indifferent and lit against the dark, moving through its night without them. The lake somewhere beyond it all, doing what it always did, patient and enormous and older than any of the things that happened on its shore. The winter was ending. The city didn't notice and didn't care and went on, and inside the brownstone in Lincoln Park, the lights went out one by one, and the house held its sounds, and the morning that was coming was not owed to anyone, was not the product of a contract or a debt or a calculation made in a desperate room. It was just the morning, belonging entirely to them.